In the quiet, unsuspecting corners of the world, monsters wear the faces of those we trust most: family, friends, and neighbors. Beneath their smiles, darkness festers, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. These are the stories of unimaginable horror, where the hands of those we once loved become stained with blood, and the line between sanity and madness is shattered. Each tale is a descent into the mind of a killer, where fear is not only felt but hunted. Welcome to the twisted realm of murderers, where survival is never guaranteed, and every shadow hides a potential threat. A small town nestled in the woods, thick fog lingering in the air as dusk turned to night. Deputy Grace Thompson had patrolled these roads for years, but something about tonight felt different, oppressive, even. The radio crackled with static, a brief update on the latest case that had gripped the town in fear. A young mother named Emily had gone missing, her abusive husband Derek the prime suspect. Grace had spent the last 3 days looking for clues, following leads that seemed to go nowhere. The tension had gripped the town, and whispers of what might have happened to Emily grew darker each day. Some said she had left town fleeing her violent husband, while others feared the worst. As Grace drove through the narrow forest road, she spotted headlights in the distance. It was an old, beat-up truck. Her heart skipped a beat. Derek owned a truck like that. Instinctively, she reached for the radio, calling in the sighting. Without waiting for a response, she turned on the sirens and signaled the vehicle to pull over. But instead of slowing down, the truck accelerated, tires screeching as it sped down the dark, winding road. Grace's pulse quickened, and she followed close behind, her sirens wailing through the night. The chase was on. The truck careened through sharp turns, barely missing trees and plunging into the thick fog. Grace gripped the wheel tightly, adrenaline pumping through her veins. Suddenly, the truck veered sharply, crashing into the side of a ditch with a sickening crunch of metal. Grace slammed on the brakes and jumped out of her car, gun drawn. As she approached the truck, her flashlight cutting through the fog, she could see the figure of Derek slumped over the steering wheel. Unconscious or dead, it didn't matter, but something else caught her eye: the passenger seat. The shape beside him wasn't moving, but it was there, something unsettling, something wrong. Grace stepped closer, her flashlight flickering slightly as she peered into the shattered window. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Emily's head severed, blood dried on her pale skin, eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. Grace stumbled back, bile rising in her throat as the full horror of the scene washed over her. Derek had been driving around with his wife's head for days, as if she were still alive. The body, she knew, had to be elsewhere. Trembling, she reached for her radio, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need backup now." But before she could finish, the sound of movement came from the back of the truck. Grace spun around, heart pounding. The door to the back swung open, and something heavy hit the ground with a thud. It was a child's doll, Emily's daughter's doll, the one that had gone missing too. Grace felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she turned, expecting to see a figure in the shadows, but nothing. The night was silent, save for the low moaning of the wind through the trees. But in the silence, Grace heard something, a faint, echoing voice. "Mama, help me." Her blood turned to ice. It was a child's voice, barely audible, but there. She turned toward the woods, the fog swirling around her as the voice grew louder. "Mama, help me." Torn between investigating the sound and calling for help, Grace took a hesitant step toward the trees, but the voice stopped. Dead silence. Suddenly, the truck door behind her creaked open. Derek was awake, his eyes wild with madness. He lunged at her, blood-stained hands reaching out, screaming incoherently about keeping his family together. Grace fired her weapon, the shot echoing in the night as Derek fell to the ground, motionless. But the nightmare wasn't over. From the corner of her eye, she saw something in the woods, something small, darting between the trees. A child's figure, pale and ghostly, disappearing deeper into the forest. Grace stood frozen, heart racing. Was it real? Or had the terror of the night begun to play tricks on her mind? She didn't know. All she knew was that something unnatural lingered in the fog, something that hadn't died with Derek or Emily. In the quiet, fog-covered town of Georgia, Pastor Gregory Hale stood as a pillar of faith and respect. Yet behind the church doors, a darkness festered within his home. His wife Eliza had been growing weaker by the day, plagued by relentless headaches that kept her locked away from the world. The townsfolk whispered about her absence, but no one dared question the pastor. One cold, stormy evening, Hale returned home with a plan. Holding a bottle of sleeping pills, he approached Eliza with a soft, reassuring smile. "These will ease your pain," he whispered. Her frail hand trembled as she took the pills, too exhausted to resist. Hale watched intently as she swallowed them, his eyes cold and calculating. Afterward, he drew her a bath. The water, warm and inviting, shimmered under the flickering light. "Rest here," he said, helping her into the tub. Eliza sank into the water, her eyelids growing heavy as the pills took effect. Her body relaxed, and soon she drifted into unconsciousness. Hale left the house, walking through the pouring rain to the church, where he knelt before the altar. His whispered prayer was laced with a twisted justification. "Forgive me, Father, for this sin, but it is your will," he murmured, his hands clutching the rosary with a false sense of piety. Hours later, he returned home. The storm had passed, but the air inside the house was thick with an eerie stillness. He went upstairs to the bathroom, where Eliza lay submerged in cold water, her lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. He stood there for a moment, the silence heavy around him, then calmly called the police. When they arrived, Hale was dry and composed, standing by the tub. "I tried to pull her out, but I couldn't." "She's gone," he said, his voice shaking, though his eyes remained unnervingly calm. The officers saw no signs of foul play, just a tragic accident, they concluded. A sick woman who had slipped beneath the water. The town mourned for Eliza, but whispers soon followed about how quickly Hale had moved on, returning to his duties at the church as if nothing had happened. But the dead have a way of seeking justice. Not long after Eliza's death, Hale began hearing strange noises in the night, dripping water, soft footsteps, whispers. At first, he dismissed them as the creaks of an old house, but soon the sounds became unmistakable. "Why didn't you save me?" a voice would hiss from the shadows. Eliza's voice. He would wake in a cold sweat, the scent of damp earth filling his nostrils. Each night, the voice grew louder, more insistent, until he could no longer sleep. One night, he awoke to the sound of water sloshing in the bathroom. Fear gripped him as he opened the door to find the bathtub filled to the brim, water spilling onto the floor. And there, sitting in the tub, was Eliza, her pale, waterlogged body staring at him with hollow eyes. "Why didn't you save me?" she whispered, her voice a haunting echo. Hale's heart raced, and he stumbled back, but the door slammed shut behind him. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Eliza's voice filled his mind, her accusations tearing through his sanity. "You let me die," she screamed, her bony hands reaching for him, the water rising higher and higher. In the morning, the townsfolk found him in the church, kneeling at the altar, muttering incoherently. His once sharp mind had fractured, his guilt consuming him whole. Pastor Hale's sin had been hidden from the world, but Eliza's ghost never allowed him to forget. And now, every time it rains in Georgia, the townspeople claim they hear the faint sound of dripping water and the mournful cry of a woman who was never saved. In a small, quiet town called Oak Hollow, strange things had been happening ever since the sudden and tragic death of Mr. Harper, a reclusive old man who lived on the outskirts with his wife. The town whispered of his cruelty, how he mistreated his wife for years, and how they were locked in a bitter divorce. But what happened one hot summer day shook the entire town to its core. It began as a typical, humid afternoon. Harper's wife, Emily, arrived at the house to get the final papers signed, marking the end of their shared life. She brought their daughter, Lily, for support. The house was old, decaying, almost as if it had absorbed all the anger and hatred that brewed inside its walls. It stood like a skeleton on the edge of the dense forest that stretched for miles, dark and untouched. As Emily and Lily walked up the creaky wooden steps, a cold shiver crawled up their spines, despite the scorching heat. Something about the house felt off more than usual. There was an oppressive silence, like the house itself was holding its breath. The old screen door squeaked as they stepped inside. Harper greeted them, his expression eerily calm. He said little, gesturing for Emily to follow him to the back room where the papers awaited. As they disappeared into the dimly lit hallway, Lily stayed behind in the living room, sitting on the edge of the worn couch. She heard muffled voices from the back, but then a silence fell that was even heavier than before. A sudden, deafening blast echoed through the house. Lily froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as the second blast rang out. She ran, stumbling through the door and out onto the porch, her scream piercing the stillness of the town. The police found Harper and Emily later that day, Emily dead from a shotgun blast, and Harper having taken his own life. But what the police didn't find, and what the town would soon learn, was far more terrifying. Days after the tragic incident, strange shadows began appearing in Oak Hollow. They were fleeting at first, barely noticed in the corners of the residents' eyes. But they grew bolder, lingering just a little too long, and always seemed to be around whenever someone was alone. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the town itself was steeped in sorrow. Lily, haunted by the memory of that day, couldn't shake the feeling that something from the house had followed her. Every night the shadows crept closer. It started with flickers at the foot of her bed, then soft whispers that only she could hear. They were growing stronger, and she was sure that her father's soul had come back. But it wasn't alone. One night, unable to sleep, she heard a sound soft, like footsteps shuffling across the floor. She slowly sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound came again, this time louder, moving down the hallway outside her bedroom. She grabbed her phone, its light flickering weakly as she stepped into the hall. The house was dark and still, too still. As she moved toward the living room, the air around her felt icy. She stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the shadowed corner of the room, stood a figure. Tall and dark, it was more than just a silhouette, it was the very embodiment of darkness. Its face was twisted, unrecognizable, yet somehow familiar. It spoke in a voice that was both her father's and something else, something much more malevolent. "You're mine, Lily." Forever she ran. She ran out of the house, down the street, and into the safety of the town. But Oak Hollow was no longer safe. The shadows followed her, watching from the corners of every street, lurking behind every door. People began to disappear one by one, swallowed by the shadows that now seemed to own the town. It wasn't long before Oak Hollow was nothing more than a ghost town, consumed by the darkness Harper had unleashed. And somewhere in the shadows, Lily still runs, never able to escape the horrors that haunt her every step.